Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new collection of trusted resources to help clarify and strengthen your participation in global missions. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi everyone. Today we'll be talking with an experienced leader and college professor who works on a daily basis with young people preparing for cross-cultural missions. We're going to learn from his experience as we explore the topic, how local churches can encourage young people in missions. Our guest on today's episode is Frank Vander Meulen. God began his work in Frank's heart regarding missions when he was a university student back in the early 90s. And together with his wife, Eleanor, he has served as a teacher in an MK school in Panama, and then for 15 years in the home office of Ethnos Canada. Now, Frank, just as we mentioned Ethnos, many of us know this agency by another name, right?
Yes, that would be New Tribes Mission.
That's it. And great organization, Frank, many faithful years there. He now serves as the Director of Intercultural Studies at Heritage College in Cambridge, Ontario, and loves encouraging people to live intentionally for the Lord and engage God's mission. Tell us just a little bit about the vision and mission of Heritage, Frank.
Heritage exists to serve the church. Another one of our taglines is equipping men and women for life and ministry. And so we're about taking young adults. Some of them have grown up in the church and some are new believers. And we want to take them as they are, build on the foundation that they have, much of which comes from the local church, and give them some good, more in-depth theological training, but also discipleship and encouragement to grow in their relationship with the Lord so that they can be more effective in terms of how they live the Christian life in their community, but then also for those who want to serve in a full-time capacity, equip them to do what they do in the context in which they do it.
Well, I just want to put in a personal word. This is a fine school at college level and seminary level as well in southwestern Ontario. My son, Frank knows my son, John, is an alumnus of Heritage, and we just thank the Lord for the time that he spent there at the college. Now, Frank, today we want to get to this practical idea of helping local churches. I appreciate that you mentioned that, both for Heritage and just your general view of missions, where the local church is the producer of missionaries. It is the laboratory in which missionaries are equipped and trained and sent out from. We want to talk about how to empower young people, especially from the local church, to participate in missions. Let's begin by talking about the culture of a local church. How can we lay groundwork for a culture in which young people are encouraged to participate in missions?
So I would say there's three parts to that question because it's a great question. The first one is this word culture, which is an interesting word. We just talked about it in class yesterday, actually. And Paul Hebert, missiologist, has this definition that culture is the integrated system of learned patterns of behaviors, ideas, and products characteristic of a society. And that sounds complicated, but in short and simply, culture is just what we do. It's what's normal for us. In a local church, missions ought to be normal. It's just like the most natural thing that we do. It's what we talk about. It's a natural part of our conversation, natural part of our church life and ministry. It's also integrated, which means it's a part of every aspect of church life. Our ministry, preaching, Sunday school, youth clubs, seniors, all of them have to have missions in mind in some way and contribute to the church's effort and missions. That's kind of what's in this idea of culture. But then there's the word culture of mission. So what is the mission of God? And it refers to God's purpose in the world. What's he all about? Why did he create? So God's purpose in creation is to glorify himself, but there's another way to look at that. So God said to Adam and Eve in the garden and to Noah after the flood, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So God's purpose is to fill the earth with people who submit to his authority as creator and king, people who live his way. Or we could say God's purpose is to fill the earth with people who live in relationship with him. And that's the story of the Bible. When Adam and Eve sinned, God didn't just kick them out of the garden and slam the door. in a sense, God walked out of the garden with them and closed the door behind them. The rest of the Bible is the story of God calling people back into relationship with him. And so this is what the church is to be about, teaching people about God and what it means to be in relationship with him. And so your question, how can a local church create a culture in which the young people are encouraged to participate in missions? 4 ideas. One would be to educate, to teach regarding God's global purpose, that would be a theme in all of the Bible teaching. Second would be to pray more often and more specifically for global needs, situations, churches around the world, cross-cultural workers. The third one I'm going to suggest would be the way we even decorate. So we decorate our churches, but we could decorate our churches with what I call art with meaning. Pictures and images that have global themes and just draw people's mind to global ideas. In a Sunday school room, pictures of kids from other worlds or other cultures with their homes to show how they live differently, just to remind kids that there are kids all around the world who are like them in many ways, but also different. World maps so that you can talk to kids about certain countries and remind them that there are kids all around the world who don't know these Bible stories. And then the same is true with other parts of the church, pictures of people from around the world and then a Bible verse that just visually and very subtly just reminds people to think globally. And then a fourth thing that could be done to create a culture would be to serve the local community. Get the young people to be serving, meeting needs in the local community, get them out in their world, so to speak, serving people and blessing people in their community in the name of Jesus. So educate, pray, decorate, and serve.
In these days, Frank, many young people are participating in short-term missions. That's a particular type of initiative used by many churches. How can a church help young people benefit as much as possible from those short-term missions?
A couple thoughts on that. One would be, as a starting place, would be to assess motivation. In the local church, when you start talking about a short-term mission trip, it's mentioned to the congregation, and people sign up. People express an interest, or they go to the meeting. And a good place to start would be to ask them what their motivation is. Why do you want to go? And part of that is addressing and highlighting the question of who's this mission trip about? Is it about people that are overseas and who need the gospel or need to be blessed in some way? Or is it about us who want to go? What's the goal of the people who come to the meeting because they're interested? Do they want to travel? Does it just sound exciting? You want to find out, what are people thinking? What do they think a mission trip is? And then how can we work with them to make sure they're thinking right and that everyone's going for the right reasons?
Now, is there any particular person you think should be asking that question?
I'm assuming that if it's a short-term mission trip, that the missions committee would be involved with that, or, one of the pastoral leaders. And they would be, I would suggest, working together. You'd want to have a few people talking to young people, because that way you get a different vibe. People pick up different vibes and get a different sense of what young people are saying.
What are other ways that we can help empower young people as they participate in short-term missions?
Yeah, well, the word empower, I think, means to give a measure of freedom to someone to do what they're responsible for. So when you think about sending young people overseas on a mission trip, you'd want to ask, what will they be doing? And sometimes it's just a lot of physical labor, which has a lot of value. But if a mission trip could include some sort of ministry that young people can actually do, in terms of spiritual ministry, conversations with people, or evangelism, or being involved in surveys, finding out a ministry that the young people can actually do so that they can be prepared for it. And then when the time comes, give them a measure of freedom to be doing that, where maybe they have to do some planning overseas and take some initiative, take some action, so that they're just not always feeling like they're told what to do. For young people to be put in a situation where they have to be creative, maybe think a bit differently, but take some initiative to make some things happen. Now, mind you, language is often a barrier. And so language has to be considered. And maybe there's an opportunity to work with young adults overseas who actually speak a bit of English. Then that opens up some opportunities for the students to take more initiative and do things. Another way to empower young people is to give them responsibilities in planning the trip and preparing the trip so that they're not just recipients of the trip and recipients of other people's hard work, but they recognize that there's a lot to do. And if I want to serve overseas, I need to be prepared to serve here and make the trip happen. Be involved in communication or administration, encourage them to be part of the work that's necessary in advance to even make the trip happen.
Yeah, that's very good. Now that's in preparation. Excellent idea. What about as the trip comes to a close or is finished?
Yeah, a friend of mine who works with a mission agency, we talked about short-term mission trips, and he said to me that the most important part of a short-term missions trip is actually the debrief. In other words, how are the trip participants prepared for coming home, and how are they followed up with after they come home? So the idea of a debrief is very significant. So talking together as a group. So if you've got a short-term team of maybe 10 young adults, 10 is a good group for some good conversation, and you'd want them to think individually, but talk collectively. What are the highlights of your trip? What are some of the positive and negative cultural experiences? What did you enjoy about the culture? What did you struggle with in terms of the culture, and why? What are some significant lessons you learned spiritually? What did you learn about yourself? What did you find that you were able to do? What did you find that you struggled with? You could ask questions about how will your experiences and the lessons you learned, how will that shape you in the immediate future? What are you going to do this year? What are you going to do the rest of your summer? And then part of empowering is to challenge them regarding ministry and service opportunities in the immediate context. So you served overseas. Great. Are you willing to serve here locally? Because there are things that we can do as a church. There are things we can do as a youth group. Are you willing to do that? Now you've learned to serve in another culture. Can you take some of those lessons to serve in your own community?
Yeah, very important.
That's also just a part of the ongoing discipleship of young people. The trip has happened, and that's significant. But discipleship is ongoing, and so we want to be able to take those lessons learned overseas and incorporate them into what they're doing in the present, because discipleship is about continual growth.
Well, that idea of lifting discipleship through short-term missions is also a key theme we're trying to brighten through the podcast here. And here I'm just going to mention actually a few other episodes that our listeners might be interested in. Episode 22 back in season 1 with Don Johnson was how to debrief a short-term mission team, right along the lines of what Frank has been talking about. And then last year, episodes 68 through 71 is a mini series on how to do short-term missions with excellence. And we cooperated with the Standards of Excellence for Short-Term Missions to put together a series of episodes. If you're thinking about doing short-term missions through your local church, I would encourage you to look over those episodes. You can check the show notes to get an outline and see if that would be helpful time spent for you. Frank, just before we take a break, I wonder if you'd just comment on short-term mission in the life of a young person springing forward and expanding their hearts in the long term.
Yeah, it's very possible for someone to go on a short-term mission trip and then come home and have the sense that they've done it. They've made their mission's contribution. But we have to go back to when we talk about the culture of missions. Like, what is missions? God's purpose is to fill the earth with people that live in relationship with him. And so you've gone overseas, you've been involved in perhaps an evangelism project, but what will it take for those people to live a life in relationship with God? So in order for people to grow in a relationship with the Lord, they need the scriptures, they need discipleship, they need someone to live with them, to show them what it means to live the Christian life, to teach what it means to live the Christian life. And so think about the people you ministered to. What's the long-term need? And what can you do now that you've been on that trip? How can you engage in meeting that long-term need overseas? Discipleship is a long-term ministry, and Bible translation is a long-term ministry. So the short-term mission trip needs to be understood as serving the long-term goal. The challenge for young people when they come home is to not think, oh, I've done missions, as if I've completed something. The challenge is to say, how can I continue to be involved in that long-term process of church planting or Bible translation?
Yeah, it's seldom going to see the mission accomplished through a short-term mission, and so that long-term perspective going to be really important. I wonder if you have practical suggestions for a church that really wants to challenge their young people to think about long-term service.
Does the church have a long-term partnership, or with a ministry overseas, or some sort of connection with a particular mission agency where they can be involved in a long-term relationship, so that maybe the church sends a short-term mission team to the same place every year? And what that does, that allows the people that you're serving overseas to develop a relationship with the church, but it also provides a little bit of familiarity. So let's say someone who's 18, they go on the trip. Well, now that they've been there, so next year when they're 19, they can maybe go again and go as a bit of a leader. And then if you have this long-term relationship, then that itself helps people, if they want to go on the trip twice, maybe 3 times, to recognize, wow, we can do a lot more the longer we're here. And that would enable them to catch a sense of how big the task is and how great it is to have a long-term relationship or a long-term presence.
Mm-hmm. This is something we are trying to do with our short-term mission workers that serve through our agency. We want to acknowledge the value of short-term missions that might be a week or 2 in length, but really challenging young people, students, and young families to consider what we call medium-term missions. Would they spend several months or even a couple of years, as you and Eleanor did, actually, on the field? It does require a significant investment of time, and it's very different than just being there for a couple of weeks. You get into a life rhythm, and your understanding of the ministry, your understanding of the Lord, your understanding of yourself grows dramatically through that extended period in a cross-cultural environment.
Our Serve Experience program here at the school is actually it was a 6-week trip. Now it's come back for logistical reasons to 4, but there are some things that happen in a 4-week trip that don't happen in a 1-week trip. And some of that is fatigue. Some of that is team bonding and team conflict. And so when you have the longer experience, that gives you enough time to get past the point where it's exciting and you recognize it's actually quite difficult and it's quite challenging. And it's at that point where some of the great lessons can be learned.
Well, very good. There's the key idea of lifting the amount of time. Sometimes that's going to be a right fit for people who have been in short-term missions, young people who have done short-term, lifting it to medium-term perhaps. In just a minute, I'm going to ask Frank to share some of the common obstacles that young people experience as they consider long-term missions. Just before we get to that, we'd like to share with you a resource that we hope would be helpful to you and your church.
For South America Mission, it's simple. Let the church be the church. For over a century, South America Mission has supported the local church in its effort to embody the kingdom of God and offer others the redemptive hope of the gospel. Join our effort through local leadership and discipleship-based ministry to help the local church flourish and demonstrate God's love and mercy to His people in South America. Visit southamericamission.org to learn more. And now, back to today's conversation.
We are back with Frank Vander Meulen from Heritage College and Seminary, and we've been discussing the importance of encouraging young people to participate in short-term missions, to consider long-term missions. Now we want to come to some obstacles, and together with Frank, we've identified a couple that are big ones today. Let's take on these 2. Frank, what's the first obstacle you want to talk about?
The big one that comes to mind is the area of parental expectations. And I'm a dad, so we have 3 kids, and we have hopes and dreams for our kids. And so sometimes young people are feeling called or they want to be engaged in missions, and they mention this to their parents, but the parents it's not necessarily on their radar. It's not necessarily what their dream is for their children. And so another aspect of parental expectations is grandchildren. So often people, they can't bear the thought of their grandchildren going overseas for years at a time. These are my grandkids,
Mm-hmm.
And then there's concerns about safety. Like, are you going to be safe? And how you can't go to that part of the world. It's dangerous there.
Right,
And
right.
I understand that because I'm a dad. I have kids, but there's more to this subject than being safe.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I have an opportunity to speak to churches now, of course, I'm very often inviting people to consider being a goer, and if the Lord is calling them to be obedient in going. But I also try and address families, parents and grandparents that you've mentioned in particular. And I suggest that part of the Lord's call for them and part of their obedience under the Lordship of Christ is to lovingly release their loved ones into the Lord's care and into his call to serve. And it is costly. Just like you said, you're a dad. I'm a dad. I particularly remember being at the airport with my family when we were leaving to move to the former Soviet Union back in the day, and how challenging it was at the airport to say our farewells. And this is one of the costs that we will need to be willing as God's people to embrace in order for message bearers to go to the ends of the earth. Well, just along this line, I want to mention a couple of episodes. Number 72 is entitled Honoring Your Parents When They Don't Embrace Your Call to Missions. It was a wonderful discussion with a young lady who wrestled with this, the reluctance of her parents, and she did so with wisdom and grace, tells her story in that episode. And then another episode with Tiffany Godby, number 53, Following the Call, When Your Family Isn't on Board. We'll include those in the show notes. So that's the first obstacle, is family expectations or parental expectations. Frank, what's the second obstacle we want to talk about here?
The second obstacle would be finances, and that's huge. What's it going to cost to go overseas? What's it going to cost to move overseas? What's it going to cost to not just to do ministry, but to actually live, to educational costs for our kids? And that leads to the issue of raising support. And what that means is really you're asking someone to live a life almost with no guaranteed financial income, living a life that's dependent on donors. And that's very difficult because people in our culture, we're very independent. We love to take care of ourselves and meet our needs. And to serve as an overseas worker means you have to ask people to join you and become a financial supporter. And you live dependent on the Lord, of course, but, it's also dependent on people. And that's something that is a big obstacle for people.
Culturally, from here, we've talked about culture throughout this episode. In the West and in Canada and the United States in particular, we are taught to be generous, but not to be unduly dependent on others, right? Work hard, provide for yourself, don't be lazy and just, count on others. And to raise support sometimes feels like we're going directly against that value, and it needs to be really carefully examined. Let's get to the helpful side of this too. What are some practical ways that churches can help young people with this obstacle?
Well, provide finances. I know that's a simple answer, but it's true. But the challenge with that is that life is expensive, and cost of living in Canada is expensive, and people are tight financially. And then there's a lot of opportunities to give to the local church, give to, the local hospital building campaign. And there's limited finances. And churches too are struggling. Bible colleges are struggling. Mission agencies are struggling financially. However, I do think there's a lot of money out there. We in many ways, we are wealthy people. We live in a wealthy society. And we spend money fairly quickly on, and maybe we just need some discernment in thinking through, what do I need? I mean, the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. What do I need, Lord, and what do I not need? And how can I be generous? In Matthew 6, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. In the context of that, the all these things that will be added is the people's concern for what their daily needs are. What are they going to eat? What are they going to wear? And Jesus, in that context, he says, I understand, but seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you. And I think that's part of the culture of the missions in the local church, is this culture of giving and simple living and generosity for the sake of the kingdom and for the sake of encouraging our young adults who really want to serve the Lord.
Well, we have touched on these two major obstacles. One is parental expectations. The other is finances, and some of the ideas that churches can consider to help get around those obstacles. Frank, just as we wind down, what are some of the resources that you would recommend to the missions committee or the leadership of local churches?
Two things. One is a book and one is a website.
Okay.
So the book that I'm holding is written by Paul Borthwick, and it's called A Mind for Missions, 10 Ways to Build Your World Vision. A website that I would suggest is called Catalyst Services, catalystservices.org.
Frank, appreciate this time you've spent with us. If any of our listeners would like to follow up with you, how could they do that?
Well, I teach at Heritage College and Seminary, and our website is discoverheritage.ca. At the bottom of the page, under College and Seminary, there's a link for faculty, and you click on that and scroll down and find me, my name, and then there's a place where you can click to contact me by email.
Frank, again, just want to say thank you for spending this time with us, with our audience, and sharing some of your wisdom and how to encourage and equip churches to bless young people as they participate in missions. Well, that concludes our conversation with Frank. Thank you for joining us. Remember that you can find show notes for this episode and every other episode at globalmissionspodcast.com. And today we'll include the resources Frank mentioned, as well as a link to Heritage College and Seminary. Our regular listeners already know this. We're always glad to hear from you. Suggested topics, feedback, or encouragement that you might have for our team. Leave us a review on iTunes or whatever app you use. That's all for now. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International and the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. Thanks for joining us today. Join us in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.